Hi everyone. My name is Meredith Cash. I am a women's sports reporter for Insider, which you may be more familiar with as Business Insider. Um, we're here talking today about International Women's Day, and that's a really great opportunity not only to celebrate accomplishments that women in sports have made over the past however long we want to go back, but also talk about where we need to move going forward and how this is a day to keep pushing. I am very fortunate to be joined by an all-star group on this panel. I have Ari Chambers on the far end, who is the founder of Bleacher Report's HighlightHER, and you might know her from basically everywhere on the internet. Jennifer O'Sullivan in the middle, who is the COO of NYCFC with a whole long title that she can get into after. And Hannah Withiam right here, who is the managing editor of Just Women's Sports. And if you haven't heard about Just Women's Sports either before today or during a panel today, we will tell you more about it, and Hannah will get into it. But I could get into each one of your backgrounds and spend the whole panel talking about that, but I think you guys will give me a more interesting read on how you got to where you are today. So I guess we can start at the far end. Ari, can you tell us a little bit about how you wound up where you are right now?
Yeah, I was just sharing this with you all that I had a really unconventional way of starting sports coverage, but I've always been intentionally on the women's side of things. I moved up to New York and I was a model and a cheerleader. So I was with the Knicks and I noticed the discrepancy between Knicks media coverage and Liberty media coverage. So I said, you know what? I have a phone. Let's make this work. So I would record my friends who played in the WNBA and I would post it online, and Bleacher Report found me and said, hey, do you want to start our women's platform? I was like, yeah, I do. And so 3 years and some change later, we're here with HighlightHER, which is a community that empowers women in sport and culture, no matter what. Shout out to my BR fan back there. No matter what age, level, ability, or sport. So that's the shortened version, but I'm so happy to be here amongst all my sisters, and just knowing that I'm intentionally on the women's side. That's what you should take back from me.
Thanks for having us today. Jennifer O'Sullivan, I'm the Chief Operating Officer, Chief Legal and Administrative Officer for New York City Football Club. I joined the club about 2 years ago. I was a partner in a law firm here in New York. I'm a lawyer by trade. Last 20 years or so, I have done a lot of different things in the industry. I was at the NFL, Arena Football League, Octagon, Sports Agency. And I was CEO and Commissioner of Women's Professional Soccer, which was my first introduction to women's sports, to soccer, and I've stayed with that over the last few years. If you had asked me when I was graduating law school where I thought I'd be, I would not have said a partner in a law firm or with a team. Or a commissioner of a women's sport. So we were talking about it before and saying, you know, life takes twists and turns, but all of it kind of leads you to where you are today, similar to your story.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm managing editor at Just Women's Sports. I, growing up, just always dreamed of being a sports writer. So I started my career at the New York Post, just tried to get kind of foot in the door, started in men's sports. But while I was there, the entire sports department was men, and naturally they were covering all men's sports. So I think I was just naive at the time. I said, why aren't we covering these great stories on women's sports? So I started really finding my niche that way and covering women's soccer, covering the Liberty since they were the hometown team. From there, moved over to The Athletic, where I was still covering men's sports in New York. But when we launched a WNBA vertical in 2019, helped oversee that, and as well as the launch of a women's college basketball vertical. And that's where I really started to find that this is what I wanted to do, and it wasn't getting the support that I felt that it needed, especially at a traditional outlet like the ones I had worked at. So when Just Women's Sports came along in 2020, it just made all the sense in the world to join a place that was fully behind covering women's sports 100% of the time. So that's what we are, and been here for almost a year.
So everyone has a pretty varied background on this panel. Vaguely, we're all in the sports space. We all touch on women's sports, but one of the things that we all have in common here, myself included, is finding a seat at the table in a male-dominated sports space. And I know, Jen, you told me a really interesting story from early on in your career before we started the panel. So I'll start with you here about how you found your way in this male-dominated space and sort of had these "I told you so" moments and strove for those.
You know, I think when I was an intern in law school, I worked for David Falk, Michael Jordan's agent, and I was looking for full-time work and said, you know, I'm not going to go work in a law firm. I wanted to go in-house and work for a team or a league. And one of the lawyers that I worked with there, and all of the lawyers were very helpful, introducing me to people that they knew. But one of them said to me, it was a very well-intentioned gentleman who said, I think you would have an easier time if you focused on women's sports. If you focused on the WNBA, you might find an easier path there. And I thought, well, why? Why does it matter? But he was like, you know, it's a really competitive landscape. As a woman, you're going to find it really difficult. And I would suggest you stick with the WNBA. I ended up interviewing with the NFL, the NFLPA, and ultimately took a job with the NFL, working for the NFL, working in securities, arbitration, and litigation, working in these very male-dominated industries. And I thought, well, I didn't have to go work in a women's sport in order to make a path for myself. But when the opportunity did present itself to work in a women's sport for me, and I got that call to be CEO and Commissioner of Women's Professional Soccer, WPS, which was the precursor to the NWSL, at that moment it wasn't because it was an easier path, it was the choice for me to go push the needle in women's sports and be and be an executive at that level, not looking to sort of find the easier path into sports. And so, you know, for me, I'm used to being the only one in the room. I'm used to sitting in a meeting with 15 men and myself. I'm used to it. I've looked at it from an early stage in my career and said, you know, well, this is just how it is, right? It is the way that it is. And now I'm at a stage in my career where it's not acceptable anymore for that to be the case. And it's not acceptable for there not to be representation across the board. It's not acceptable that we don't give women's sports equal space in the media or on TV or on the radio or wherever it is in conversation. It's not acceptable to have that anymore. And so I think your career ebbs and flows, but you learn, you grow, you develop, and realize that like those well-meaning, well-intentioned things, you know, weren't really well-meaning or intentioned at all. They were limiting or intended to limit. And so being able to bust out of that mold and say that wasn't limiting at all for me.
I want to hop in on that because I know he has to turn it on. But I want to hop in on that because I want women to realize that we belong in any space we wish to occupy. And by having more, not being satisfied with being the first or the only, we're more empowered to speak up when we have unsolicited advice that, you know, nobody really called for. And so my power comes from like being able to be vocal in these rooms because I bring people on with me and I can look to my left and my right and I see another woman, another person of color that can help empower me if I am backed against the wall. But me being me, only child, never really understood the word no. So I have never been afraid to voice how I feel. And just like you, a lot of people told me, shockingly, that I'd have an easier time on the men's side. I don't know how to interpret that. I know exactly what they mean. But my intention has always been on the women's side. And so I've stayed strong in that and not for an easy route because it's not by any means easy because you have to deal with, you know, convincing people to invest, convincing people to pour into the game, convincing people of things. Obviously, you know that. You've worked in it. But just knowing that women's sports, it's not the easy way out. It's not convenient for a woman to work in women's sports. It's not convenient for us to work in any sports space at this point. But the hope is so we can have more talks like this and more opportunities to sit together and band together and push the game forward, the women's game forward.
And every day of the year, not just International Women's Day, although today is a perfect day to spread that message. Hannah, I'm going to throw to you on this because I know that you, like me, have spent a lot of time trying to fight in the media space to get women's sports coverage. And early in your career, before you were at Just Women's Sports, a lot of what you were doing was trying to get women's sports out there in mainstream publications. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think as I was saying before, when I started my career at the New York Post, the stories I wanted to tell were in women's sports, and that was natural for me as a storyteller. But I'd also be lying if I didn't say, like, those were the opportunities. You know, we had 15 sports writers on the team, all covering men's sports. They had their dedicated beats. No one was covering it. So I wanted to get my byline in the paper. I wanted to get my clips, my name out there. So those were the stories I was pitching and writing a lot of the time. And I mean, anyone who's worked in journalism, and I think really any industry, it's all about the numbers and the results. And unfortunately, when one women's sports story wouldn't perform well, it would lead to a destructive cycle where they might not give you the opportunity the next time. So when you're not telling these stories consistently and your audience doesn't know to come to you for women's sports, it's as everyone was saying, if you're not investing in it, then how are you going to really know how successful it is? So that was the case there. And similar at The Athletic, like we would take baby steps, I think. But it would be a case where, you know, we launch a WNBA vertical, and I'm very proud of what we did, but it's kind of like, okay, pat ourselves on the back, we did that. It's like, no, we could actually, you know, expand this and do much more. We have a writer covering almost every men's team and every professional sports league. One writer can't cover the entire WNBA and women's college basketball. So those things were often falling on deaf ears, which is why Just Women's Sports just made all the sense in the world to work with people who really see that vision, just like these ladies do, and you do as well.
For sure. And I think part of what you're saying here is that there's unfortunately a higher burden of proof for women in sports, women's sports, trying to get the message across that this is an entity that's here to stay, and it's a real business opportunity. Ari, I feel like HighlightHER is the ultimate industry disruptor. Like, you built that from scratch and you made the case. How have you gotten, you know, some of the most premier, huge companies to invest in your space and partner with you and take you seriously as an entity when all of these roadblocks are in your way?
With intention and conviction. The first 2 years of HighlightHER, we weren't on market. We wanted to make sure that we paid attention to the consumer, the women's sports fan, and really had that intentionality of, hey, if we're going to say we're women's sport and culture, we're not neglecting the culture. If we're going to say we're all ages, levels, abilities in sport, I have to challenge myself to know that bowling is happening right now. Do y'all know I've never watched a bowling situation before? I had fun with my friends bowling, but I didn't know they have like tournaments for these things. So just pushing myself outside of the realm that I would normally be in and really walking exactly what I want the platform to communicate. And people pay attention. I'm fortunate enough that we were on, you know, all of us were on the wave up. We were trending upward and caught the wave right before it crashed, and we are looked at as the innovators, the shapeshifters in the space, and so people want to get behind those who really, really were on it before the trend happened. But my goal for HighlightHER, for Just Women's Sports, for everything in between is that women's sports aren't a trend. We're here to stay. We've occupied, you know, we're 50 years on Title IX right now. We had WNBA, the longest standing women's pro sports league in the United States, going on its 26th season this season. And so just knowing that there's nothing that's going to make them fold now, and we're here to stay. And another thing that I think we said maybe right before I started talking, we need to stop being afraid of like failing on the women's side of things. We try so hard to make everything a hit. I'm thankful that my platform got to fly under the radar enough that I could tell things organically and in the way I wanted to, so that people weren't like, oh, the numbers aren't there, because the numbers will get there. The numbers weren't there for men's sports back in the 70s. We know this, and I hate this comparison, but just making sure you stay true to your mission, staying true to what the message you're trying to deliver, and staying true to your consumer and knowing what their appetite is.
And I should add that the NWSL is now going into its 10th season, if I'm correct, and that makes it the longest-standing women's professional sports league in the country, I believe, as well. Which takes me to you, Jen. Obviously, you have experience building a brand, building a league, and running it, and I think you can speak uniquely to building something that's sustainable and what needs to happen and what basically what framework needs to be built and where the investment needs to come from for these leagues to be successful going forward.
Yeah, I think just to also, I was going to jump in on what you were saying, is because I think we do hold our women's sports to a different standard, a higher standard than we hold male sports. And the question is always like, well, does it make business sense? What's the business plan? And yes, those are absolutely 100% the right questions to be asking. But if you look at the NFL today, it didn't look like that when it first started. The NBA didn't always look like the way that it does now. And I think with women's sports, there is, when you're looking at ownership, you need to ensure that whoever is getting behind that league or that sport is going to be there for the long haul. They have to be willing to put that investment in and to continue to put that investment in, because you can't say, well, if I don't get my money back in 3 years, I'm out. That's not, no one does that when they invest in MLS. No one does that. Why shouldn't they do that? Why should they do that on the NWSL side, right? So you need a very strong ownership base who sort of understands what the commitment is and the level of investment is that's in it. You have to understand that this is an age of instant gratification, but from a league and an athlete perspective, it isn't going to be there overnight. And so we have to understand that there is a building process to it. You need to align with strong brands. It used to be, when I was with WPS, I had people arguing to me that, it really you should just be asking people, it's like a charity. They should just be giving you money because it's the right thing to do. That is not why you should be giving. You should be giving and investing in a sport or a league because you believe in it, because you have the same shared values, because you have a unique platform within which you can build a partnership. And the same reasons why you would invest in a men's league, right? The questions are going to be the same. How many eyeballs are going to see my product, and how many people ultimately are going to be coming to the games? How many butts do you have in seats? All of that. And all of that takes time to build, right? And I think that the NWSL has been able to do something that WUSA and WPS weren't able to do, and that is have that long-term, longevity and that ability to exist. But the thing that we had in WPS that is a missing ingredient, I think, for NWSL is we had the best product in the world playing in WPS. All of the best players played in our league because there were no other opportunities anywhere else. So we had a very strong product here in the U.S. to capitalize on. When WPS went under and there was a year taken off before U.S. Soccer decided to get involved and manage NWSL, players scattered and they looked for opportunities anywhere that they could. And players, let's be honest, in any sport have a very finite playing career. Women have an even smaller playing career. And so they need to capitalize and leverage where they can. And so they looked for other opportunities. They looked to go to Europe. They looked to go to Australia. And that was the birth of leagues in those regions that now serve as a great model for the women's game globally, but they provide huge competition for us here in the U.S. as we try to build on the game here. And so, yeah, our women's national team has been dominant for years, but they're not as dominant as they used to be anymore because now there's great competition coming out of Germany, coming out of England, Japan, and other places. Again, phenomenal for the game globally and something that we all love to see, but it just makes us really look at what we're doing here in the U.S. and how can we build a stronger league. It needs more investment. It needs more investment from an ownership side. It needs more investment from a brand and a sponsorship and a partnership side in order to make it the most attractive place for players globally to want to come and play.
Absolutely, and I think one more component of that Hannah and I are both intimately familiar with is the coverage also needs to be there from big and small publications. We all need to put our money where our mouth is, essentially, and cover the story. Just Women's Sports is doing that, obviously, in a very big way. We saw it shouted out along with HighlightHER during the last panel. But it's not lost on me that I think the media space is playing catch-up compared to 25 years of the WNBA, 10 years of the NWSL. I'm at a national publication, and I'm the only person covering women's sports exclusively. You know, Just Women's Sports is the outlier here, and you came from two publications where you were fighting for a spot to cover women's sports. I'm curious why now was the right time for you to join Just Women's Sports, and what that calculus was like for you to join on.
Yeah, I think we've hit on a lot of these points with why covering women's sports 365 days a year at all levels is so important. I think to sort of like get nerdy in journalism for a minute, we had perfect examples this year where why having someone dedicated to covering women's sports is so important to push the game forward. Like we all saw Meg Linehan's amazing, also harrowing story on the NWSL scandal last year, and that led to significant change and a movement, really. And that's because she covers that sport regularly. She builds these relationships. She's supported by, she has the infrastructure behind her at the company to tell a really difficult story like that takes a ton of time to report out, have these difficult conversations. We saw it again with a story on the Howard Megdal on Sports Illustrated, the Liberty flight scandal recently, and that's going to, again, ignite these conversations about change in the WNBA and why players need more resources when it comes to travel and things like that. So I think that was illuminated for me as I was working at the Post and The Athletic before joining Just Women's Sports. And it's not only when a scandal happens and these, bigger outlets might be parachuting in to cover those things, like the weight room scandal, the NCAA tournament last year, but we're covering it year round. We're covering the actual games. We're going to write the stories about what we've seen in men's sports for years, just the analysis stories on top of the human interest and the actual, hard-hitting journalist pieces. So that's our mission, and that was really the impetus for me to switch over.
I am with you, and I am such a fan of Just Women's Sports and what you guys are doing, so kudos to you for it, because I think it's a big move. I want to talk about how, we've all touched on how women's sports forever has been doing so much with less. And I think the fact that these leagues and these teams and these women and these players in these spaces are, you could speak to this, leading the culture. I think they're leading diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. I think they are leading voices on social justice. And I'm curious why you see, each of you, these spaces where you're fighting for coverage, you're fighting for acknowledgement and recognition, why they're taking that leap and leading the charge that way. And let's start with you, Ari, because I think you might have something to say.
Your question is why the players are pushing themselves for?
I think that, we saw players in the WNBA, for example, talking about Black Lives Matter before Colin Kaepernick kneeled.
I got you. So I can speak to the WNBA because this is what I'm most well versed in. As a black woman, a league of 80% black women, you have no choice but to fight for equality, fight for equity, fight for what's right, because they performed for a society that doesn't see their humanity. And that's with the LGBTQIA plus community as well. It's just, you can take a uniform off, you can't take your skin off. You can walk through life, but if you're conscious or overly conscious about interacting with your partner, that's the situation. So I know, speaking to a lot of players, they're trying to create a better life for future generations. We're becoming more comfortable with things outside of the norm, outside of our cis-het white male space. And historically, that's what sports has been. It's uncomfortable for people to accept women in sport. And heaven forbid them be a part of a group that hasn't been digestible to society in general. So that's what they're fighting against. The players have learned that they have the power in their hands with social media now. You saw Sedona speak out about NCAA inequality last year. You saw, Sue Bird coming forward courageously, though we all knew, with her relationship. You've seen NECA and the WBPA draw together 144 athletes in a bubble, some of which are mothers having to look at their black sons in a time where Jacob Blake got shot and have a very public demonstration that could have risked a lot by protesting their game. You see all these players come together because there's no other choice. And so if you don't fight for your humanity, I don't know how you're going to be able to perform for people who don't see it. So.
And to piggyback on that too, I think you're talking about players who have realized they have a very unique platform and an ability to use their voices in a way that they're compelled to do, because as you say, they don't know any other way forward. They have to. And I think it's been the same thing for the women's U.S. national team in soccer. They have fought for this equality fight. Didn't just start the last couple of years. It's gone on since the 99ers, right? The fight for equal pay. But very similarly, the LGBTQI community in soccer, I mean, that was sort of a secret. It was like the marketing push for soccer has always been like the ponytail crew. That's what they called them, right? That was like the all-American, blonde-haired, ponytailed, like dads bringing their daughters to games, and that's what it was. But the reality is that's not who the players all are. It's a very diverse group of players, and a much more diverse group of players now than it has been in the last 20 years or so. And so I think when you see that, and when you see players like Megan Rapinoe, again, others who realize, I have a very unique platform. I have a voice. I have eyeballs and ears that are going to listen to me. Those are the ones that we have to give our thanks to, because they put themselves on the line. It's not just about talking for themselves, as you said. They're talking about for other generations, for the generations that are coming up after them, and realizing they're putting their own careers on the line, their own reputations on the line by being able to do this, but they're living their true selves. And in order to do that, they do that for others, and they do that for the generations that come after them, and hopefully we're in a better place. I think a lot of this, we want to celebrate some of the progress that we've made today, but recognizing that there is still so much more to do. And I think a lot of it is generational, a lot of it is cultural. It's a journey, and it's not a sprint, and it's not going to happen overnight, and we are constantly going to be talking about this. And when people say, oh, why do we always have to talk about race? Oh, why do we always have to talk about gender? Oh, well, you know what? Because the field is not equal. It's not an equal playing field yet. And until it is, and when it is, then we won't have to talk about it. And it shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't be hard conversations. It should just be. But until that point, we're going to have the hard conversations, and we're going to keep doing it, and we're going to be grateful to the athletes who are using their voices and their platforms to be able to do that.
Sorry, Hannah. I just want to let you guys know, it is a privilege to say, why do we have to talk about race, or why do we have to talk about gender? Because like the leagues that we represent, or the leagues that, what we're trying to push forward, they don't have the luxury of stepping away from their gender or their race. And I just want to challenge people, our allies out there, to know that this is why it's so repetitive to you all, but it's repetitive because there's no change happening, or change is happening slower than what it needs to, or change isn't happening to the effect that we want. And we're going to keep pushing. And then now leagues themselves, like I see a lot of intersectionality between the NWSL and the WNBA. Heaven forbid we all band together. Who's going to stop us? And so that's where we're at now.
Hope you never apologize for speaking over me, Ari. I always want to hear your point on that. Yeah, the only thing I'd add to those great points is I think when we had this conversation around, 2 years ago, like stick to sports, I think women for years were feeling like they were judged on anything but the sports for a long time. They were judged for being different, for their race, their sexual orientation, their identities in other ways. And all of a sudden, they're being asked, why aren't you sticking to sports? It's like, well, we tried, but it's just a part of our identity, and we can't walk away from that, as Ari said. So women have really led the way in that, and I think that if you weren't noticing before, you were woken up to it. I think with the WNBA and what they did in 2020, and every other league we've seen since then.
You know, I think we've all spoken about just how far these leagues have come and broken down these barriers that have intentionally been placed to limit women in sports. And I'm curious, you know, a stigma clearly still persists where women don't belong in sports. The space is not built for us. Where do we go from here, and how do we continue breaking down those barriers so we can talk about the WNBA and the NWSL in the same conversations as other men's sports leagues and the top athletes in the world? Because that's really where we are at this point, right? They're here, they're not going away. How do we make them mainstream and taken seriously? Because everyone on this panel's there. We're already doing it.
I would actually challenge the consumer, because there are so many people doing the work small scale. If you show that the numbers are there, bigger companies are going to want to put money behind it. And so as media, it's our responsibility to actually pay attention to what's going on in the landscape that we're covering. And again, going back to intentionality, that having an intentional desire to storytell, intentional desire to put those X's and O's out there, the stats, if you're not a storyteller, intentional desire of, you know, pushing those meetings like, hey, no, we're not going to just, you know, have one situation here. We're going to cover it all. But as a consumer, if you're demanding that, hey, we need more women's sports coverage, but you're not clicking the Just Women's Sports newsletters, if you're not watching the HighlightHER chatters, it just doesn't make sense, right? How am I going to come up to the head of BR and be like, hey, y'all, need more resources if it has 1,000 views? That don't make sense. So we're going to keep pushing it forward as media, but those out there, just bring a friend in the arenas. Talk about it. Keep talking about it. Keep being energized by the fact that there's so much upward trajectory happening with women's sports. And know that, like, hey, I came from a woman. You know, I might, you know, have a child who's a girl. I might have a friend who's a woman that occupies these spaces. Just know that we belong there and want to talk about it. So repetition and conviction and intention and consumption.
I think a lot of it is also the brands, right? Connecting with the consumer. I think there's a connection there, and consumers want to align with brands who align with their values and their belief systems. And I think we're seeing that at our club when we focus on very intentionally who we do business with and how we do business with them. And our fans respond to that. They respond accordingly. But I also think it's exposure, right? You know, I haven't tried hard. It just is it just is for me. I have 3 kids. I have 2 boys and a girl, and I treat them the same, and I expose them to the same things. And my boys have been to just as many, you know, women's sports events as they have been, you know, male events. And my oldest, when he was 5 years old, said to me, Mommy, I know who all the best soccer players in the world are. And I said, you do? Who are they? And he said, Hope Solo, Carly Lloyd, Alex Morgan. And it was not a Messi or a Ronaldo in that group. And, you know, it wasn't because I pushed it down his throat, but I exposed him to it, right? And when they're exposed to that, they grow up normalizing it, and they realize that, like, wow, you know, so women athletes, male athletes, it doesn't matter. There's no difference, right? There's no difference for them. So they can watch a women's college basketball game, a women's softball game. It's just a game to them. It's normal. And our girls need to see that. And when people say, like, well, we need to build up our girls, I always say we need to build up our boys to respect the women in their lives, to respect other women, and to respect female athletes, and to see them as equals, to treat them as equals. You know, and I already see that, and I see a difference in the dialogue and the way that kids today talk about sports, and they talk about athletes, and you know, when you talk about in our schools when they have you know, who do you want to dress up as or whatever, Halloween, I looked around and I saw more Candace Parkers walking around. I saw more Alex Morgans walking around. I mean, I saw these girls dressed up as female athletes that they look up to and that they admire, and I thought that was amazing. I mean, there was a whole WNBA team, and there was a whole, just in a couple of grades, and it was awesome to see, because that would never have happened when we were younger, because we didn't have that. We didn't have those role models, really, right? And so these kids have them, and boys and girls alike are seeing that. And so I think exposure just has a lot to do with it, and ensuring that our kids have that equal exposure.
I've thought a lot about that too with, for example, the introduction of the video games, like the NBA 2K introducing WNBA recently, and just having grown up with three brothers, watching sports all the time, playing video games. If we could have played as like Candace Parker, and they saw that as normal, and it was part of the regular discourse, like that would have really changed things. And I think, little boys would have idolized a Candace Parker. So yeah, it's really cool to hear you say that you're seeing that with your kids, and I think that is part of the next generation. And then, yeah, as you said, just normalizing women's sports. Like, I think a lot to Adia Barnes' quote at the NCAA tournament last year when she was pumping breast milk during halftime of the championship game. And it's like, let's normalize working mothers. We don't talk about it enough. And same goes for women's sports coverage. Let's not hop in when it's trendy to cover women's sports and check that box, pat ourselves on the back. We filled our quota. It's make it 365 days a year and cover it when it's bad, when it's good. Let's have debate shows. Let's have these tough conversations, and yeah, I think I really see that in our future, especially with the work everyone's doing.
Agreed. And I think, in the realm of exposure, I think generationally, it's huge to see that change that you're talking about with your kids, that you're talking about on video games, where kids will grow up, boys, girls, every gender, idolizing the Candace Parkers of the world. I play FIFA with the U.S. women's national team. I hope they incorporate women's clubs there. But I think we can't afford to just wait for the next generation to come in and be raised that way. And while that's an important thing that we're doing, and it's huge, and hopefully by the time they come into positions of power, we're already at a point where what they know is being brought into the business world and into the media world and et cetera, every power player. But we need to convince the people in positions of power right now, and some of you are probably in the room, or people in the room know people who are in those positions of power. So I'm wondering what more we can do to send that message that, you need to invest in creating this exposure for the youth and for everyone. And if any of you have thoughts on that, I'm all ears.
The cost of inaction is greater than the risk. And so if you don't get on it now, it's, like I said, women's sports are here to stay. The exposure is going to keep going up. The social media is changing the landscape with platforms like HighlightHER, Just Women's Sports, WSlam, Overtime Women's Basketball, the GIST, Girls Talk Sports TV. Everybody is working hard to put it in front of people's faces, so you have a generation coming up that doesn't know when women didn't play professional sports. They didn't have to worry about how Love and Basketball was framed because the WNBA was right there from 97 on. They didn't have to worry about, worrying about professional soccer because it's there for them. And so if the longer you wait, the more you're going to be playing catch up. And I know I'm just kind of preaching to the choir at this point because y'all are botting because y'all are at this panel, right? But the cost of inaction is greater than the risk.
I think it isn't just about women's sports generally, but it's women in sports and in the business of sports. Because like you said, we belong, right? We all belong. And I think for us at our club, we have a long history of community work, and that's really important to us. And so we focus on making soccer accessible to everyone in the 5 boroughs. And but we're also focused on how do we also get to the pipeline early so that those kids out there know that there are other things you can do in sports besides be an agent, a player, or a coach. And ensuring that we are getting to them, whether it's internship opportunities, whether it's career days, whether it's just going out and talking to them to say, like, these are all, you're interested in graphic arts, well, you can do that in sports. Or, you want to be a massage therapist, you can do that in sports. Like, there's all of these, different things that kids out there may not even know or realize. And so again, it's about exposure. It's exposing those kids to it. But we're also trying to be more intentional about our hiring practices and looking at that, really taking a deep dive into that and saying, okay, where do we post for our jobs? Is that the best places we should be posting? How do we build out our own networks? How do we reach out more to those within our networks that are more diverse and representative of what we want to be? We always say we represent the city of New York. We want to represent the diversity of the city of New York and the people who make up the 5 boroughs. And so how do we do that intentionally, right? And so I think we are spending a significant amount of time to make sure that we're doing that. And by doing that, ensuring that you have representation across the board, whether that is gender, whether that's race, whether that's disability, whatever that might be, you now have that diversity of perspective and diversity of thought. And it's not just what you look like, and it's not just about checking the box like you said before. It is about really, truly being representative so that you have that your perspective is not the same as my perspective. I may miss something. You may catch something that we're not thinking about. You'll bring up something that we haven't considered. And if we don't do that, right, we do a disservice to the industry, and we do a disservice to women, people of color, people who are different abled. Like, those are all things that we need to be considering as we sort of build our teams. And so as leadership and at the executive level for us, that accountability is really important to us, that we have it at the top, that we know that we're taking a top-down approach to representation across the board, to DEI, to our work in the community, and ensuring that, we're not going to be perfect. We know that, but we're doing the best job that we can do, and that we're constantly learning and trying to do better and be better.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, and I don't know if this is sharing just a sports secret, but something we like to say a lot is hype, not guilt. There's no use in guilting people into following women's sports. It's a short-term fix, as we've been talking about. You want to normalize it. So it's a reason we all became women's sports fans and now we're involved, is because sports are awesome and the athletes are inspiring and their stories are worth reading and following. So I think it's just bringing that positive coverage. It's not always positive, but following the games and the exciting moments that will draw these new fans in is what the mission is.
Don't kill me, because Hannah just said something. A lot of people always ask me, like, how do you deal with the haters and what do you respond? How do you deal with the trolls? And I'm like, my job isn't to convince you. My job is to expose you. I sprinkle my passion on people. I don't try to prove them wrong. I prove the supporters right. So I love that perspective. Hype, not guilt. Shout out to y'all at Just Women Sports for that. But yeah, it's sprinkling your passion, and whenever it sticks, it can turn, a casual sports fan into a diehard with one story. It can turn somebody who was just clicking through, like, hey, what are they doing? I just saw that they were protesting. Let me just pay attention to them when they are playing. So it's just about not coming from a place of defense, but just knowing that we are meant to occupy these spaces. And now that we've had, the years to prove it, we're keeping going in this upward trajectory.
Hear, hear. Thank you all for A, being on this panel with me today and speaking to this, but B, putting in all of this hard work to normalize women's sports, to normalize women in these spaces, and doing this work every single day of the year, not just International Women's Day, although, again, today is a perfect day to have these discussions and go over it. So thank you all.